Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Neurotech.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Mark Domyahn, and he is a partner at JD Lymon, which is a US-based reimbursement strategist consulting group. And we talked previously, I saw you at a conference. I thought it was really good. And we talked previously, and I really liked it. I thought it was really fun talking to you and learning a lot about your perspectives on things. First of all, thanks so much for coming on. And do you want to introduce yourself a little bit better than I just did?
No, sure. I very much appreciate being here. And thanks so much for the opportunity. So again, Mark Domyahn, partner of the JD Lymon Group. We focus on the U.S. market, and it's coding, coverage, payment, market access, health economics, call it what you will, in terms of really trying to figure out how medical technologies, in particular devices for the most part, get paid from payers. What's the coding? What's the payment amount going to be, or coverage, all of those sorts of things. That once you get through the FDA, now it's about commercialization and what does your reimbursement look like with Medicare, with private payers. Typically, it's private payers and Medicare. Sometimes it's Medicaid or the VA, but for the most part, it's Medicare or CMS as well as private payers.
Yeah, this is a very nice basic overview of how things go. Yeah, so basically you have a company, you get passed through FDA, you get approval. So that means you can sell it, but then you have to get paid, as you said, and either private payers or insurance. Obviously, insurance is maybe the more preferred route because they have deeper pockets than individuals, and VA also has deep pockets. So yeah, let's talk about maybe some of the benefits. It's maybe easier to sell to individual consumers, like in terms of approval and everything like this, but it's maybe harder to get money. Or maybe what are some costs and benefits of all of those different options?
No, I think the biggest thing is that, and this is more my opinion than anything else, but for a couple of generations now, the U.S. patient, as you will, isn't used to paying for healthcare. We don't pay for a lot of out-of-pocket. We expect insurance to pay for it. And that's changed over the last decade or so, a decade and a half, as more employers are pushing deductibles and co-insurance. Payers are pushing co-insurance and deductibles for patients to have skin in the game, so to speak. But in terms of if you're trying to sell a device for $100 over the counter, may make the most sense in the world. Trying to sell something for $10,000, and that's just your price, let alone if you're implanting something or there's hospital involved or a physician involved, which there typically is. To the patient cost of that, even though your device might cost $10,000, to that patient it might be 15 or 20. And so asking from a market size perspective, if you can get insurance to help cover those things and pay for those things to treat whatever disease state you're targeting, I think certainly opens up the market potential, as opposed to asking, hey, you need to be able to write a check for 15, 20, 30K to treat it. Now, and there is that segment of the population, but in my experience, that's a pretty nice slice of the market. And so having insurance available and covering it, whether it be Medicare, private payers, or all of the above, certainly helps facilitate market growth and market adoption.
Yeah, for sure. So what's a process of getting reimbursement approved, let's say through an insurance company? And is that something you do before you start FDA approval process, or before or during or after? How does it usually look like?
Yeah, and my favorite answer to every question you ask me today, Layden, is going to be it depends. And it does depend on the technology and where you are in the process and what you're trying to solve for. And are you first to market, or you 10th to market, those sorts of things. But in general, at a high level, when you're starting to think about your regulatory pathway as a device company, am I going to go 510K? Am I going to be 510K de novo? Am I exempt? Am I PMA? You should be starting to think about your reimbursement strategy. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is it's never too early to start thinking about your reimbursement. And number two is the FDA writes zero checks. They give you a license to hunt, but they don't guarantee you kill anything, to use that metaphor. And insurance is where, whether it be Medicare or private payers, they're the ones actually writing checks. And in my opinion, insurance serves an important role in the entire healthcare community, but they're built to say no. They're not there to say, hey, everybody can have everything. They're there to use the beneficiary dollar effectively and efficiently. And we can argue from whose perspective and all those sorts of things, but understand from the get-go that payers are built to say no. And we want to figure out the ways to get them to say yes. And again, it will depend on each company and each technology and the situation and a lot of other factors, but starting to think about it early so you plan accordingly is really important, particularly in today's environment as healthcare dollars are getting stretched thinner and thinner. Folks don't like to pay out of pocket, even with high deductible plans, those sorts of things. It's really important to think about those things early and not to wait, hey, I'm launching in 6 weeks. Your options are limited. And the last thing I'll say here, at least on this comment, is reimbursement tends to lag regulatory. So I can get commercialization, my 510K clearance on, say, January 1 of 2022, where reimbursement may take more time, particularly if I have to go get new codes or I've got some coverage issues with payers. And so thinking about those things earlier and factoring them into your business plans, whether it be about clinical publications, engagement with physician societies, and in some cases, potentially even working with your competitors, reimbursement tends to float all boats. Those are the sorts of things you at least want to identify early. What options do you have? And then figure out the best, plan for your technology that meets your business.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. And in this way, the competitors might help you and help everybody. So what are some common timelines, timeframes that we're looking at? If it takes you X amount of time to go through the FDA, how long does that take to go through the regulatory process? And what's different in terms of the requirements?
Yeah, it's it depend a lot on the technology and what you're treating, but it's a good question, and we get it quite often. The regulatory timeline is what it is in terms of, and it will differ if you're 510K de novo, or PMA. And those pathways, you talk to your regulatory folks, they can help outline what those would look like. From a reimbursement perspective, it's going to depend a little bit on the regulatory pathway, as well as you think about, are you a brand new novel technology, truly novel, versus a Me Too product? And there's nothing wrong with a Me Too strategy. I don't mean to say that's a bad idea at all. But basically, do you have to go create new codes? Are you in a non-coverage or a covered environment? If you're another TENS unit, TENS units are covered for certain things, or you're another implantable spinal cord stimulator. That's just fine, versus I'm going to be the next neurostimulation that cures some other medical condition. I'm going to be a neurostimulator that's implanted in the back that cures my osteoarthritis. Okay, that's a different type of pathway than what exists today. And that can take much, much longer. So the first question tends to be, do you fit into existing codes or not, both CPT and ICD-10, and not to be too acronym heavy here, but can the physicians bill for you? Can the facilities bill for you? Or do you have to create new codes? Those getting new category 1 CPT codes is at a minimum a 3-year process. It's more like a 5 to 7 year process, depending on, again, the technology in the space and competitors and what else is there. But that's after FDA approval and meet requirements, and then working through the process. So things can take considerable time after FDA approval. And that's where thinking about these things early, getting the support you need, whether it be through a consultant like us, or whether it be through hiring somebody who's got the expertise to help shorten that time window from FDA clearance or approval to quote unquote appropriate reimbursement. So having coverage, coding, and payment in place so that at least it's not a barrier to your market adoption. There may be other reasons in terms of competitive products or your sales force or channels, those sorts of things. But ideally, what we're trying to do is take reimbursement off the table where the providers, both physicians and facilities, get paid adequately to support the average sales price of your product. So again, depending on what you're launching, you could launch right into existing codes and you've got existing payment. As long as your business model supports that, your price is, that can be a very attractive scenario because you almost got it from day one, versus, hey, it's truly novel, need new codes, may need a new coverage pathway, payment's a little bit up in the air. That can take time. And each of those elements, coverage, coding, and payment, each have different timelines as well. Payment tends to come a little faster than coding in some respects, and coverage is always dealing with payers. So that tends to be the last of the three, coding, coverage, and payment. Coverage tends to take the most time, particularly for novel technologies. But again, it will depend on your technology and what you're launching and what the disease state, those sorts of things. Again, which is, I'm going to keep harping on this throughout, but that's why you want to plan early so that what you're walking into and the requirements and what your time, set realistic expectations from a timeline perspective for your internally, externally, your investors, when you're talking to raising money, all of those sorts of things that you're presenting an objective picture with some upside in terms of if you're able to accelerate things.
Okay. And there's lots of insurance companies out there. So basically, if you're able to get one code, you got them all, or do you have to individually go after them, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. So coverage and coding and payment for the basic elements at a high level: coding, coverage, and payment equals reimbursement. Each of those things are interrelated, but they're independent. From a coverage perspective, that can vary by payer. So Aetna may cover something that United Healthcare does not, or that Humana does not, or that Medicare does or does not. And even within those plans, there can be different coverage, because Aetna and United Healthcare, Humana, they have lots of different products as well. So it's not just they have one insurance policy. They will tailor it depending on who they're working with too. So their products, even within an insurance company, can differ in terms of what they will and will not cover. So coverage will vary payer to payer. Coding, which is more the language of reimbursement, the code is the code. So 63650, which describes the implantation of a spinal cord lead, epidural, that's the same for United Healthcare, for Aetna, for Medicare, for Medicaid, workers' comp. All payers, they tend to use the same code so that they can, diagnosis code's the same thing. What's wrong with the patient? Why did they come see me? There's diagnosis codes. Everyone uses them. There's much more consistency. And so if I got a code, that's great. Now I can be, found by that payer. And then it's working with each to figure out, will they or will they not cover me? We tend to group them together. So Medicare is a payer, even though there's some granularity there, and it's not just one single entity, but we tend to talk, do we think Medicare will cover me, as well as then privates, but the same thing. I might have Aetna. There's plenty of examples of Aetna covering something, for example, and United Healthcare does not, or Humana does not. So it is going to depend a lot, again, on your space, what technology you're bringing to market, what is your coding, and where you fit in the continuum. And sometimes, honestly, it's just in terms of coverage isn't always the most logical thing, why some things are and some things are not covered. I've had the experience where it was someone knew somebody, and that's why we got covered, when everybody with one private payer and everybody else was dead set against the technology. And sometimes that happens as well. Just because you have a code does not guarantee anything from a payment or a coverage perspective. And that's why looking at the full gamut, coverage, coding, and payment, is so important, again, earlier in the process as opposed to later, so you can plan it.
Yeah, it really sounds like the coverage is like the holy grail. Obviously, out of pocket, that can give you, again, like you were saying, depending on the price point, but it can give you some funds. But then if insurance can cover it, then that definitely opens up the door to a lot more customers. How would you compare, contrast that to VA or an out of pocket? What kind of, in your experience, what kind of revenues come from basically insurance versus out of pocket versus VA versus other options?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think with payer by payer, the VA is its own entity. It's got its own, it's separate and distinct. So the VA, if you're treating a condition that veterans need, the VA is a great place to start, because they're a little bit more manageable. They've got their own budget, and depending on what you're treating. So if I'm treating PTSD, I'm absolutely going to start with the VA and the Department of Defense, because that's my target patient population. Or things like pain, the types of conditions where you would expect veterans and folks who serve in our military may have a few more of those sorts of conditions. But that's going to vary by product to product, and the indications for which you're treating. I think for most products, in my experience, it's primarily from a bucket perspective, it's Medicare and then the private payers. And it doesn't mean you ignore workers' comp, or you ignore TRICARE or the VA or any of those other payers. But usually, in my experience, if you're really anything to deal with something like heart failure, that's a disease of age. That's primarily a Medicare patient population. And not to say that there aren't Medicare patients in the VA system, but the bulk of Medicare are going to be outside of that insurance plan. So it's going to be very dependent on the technology you're coming to. But for the most part, we see companies from a business plan perspective really focus on Medicare and private payers, and then opportunistically thinking about some of the other payers that make up the rest of the ecosystem, with potentially this, I guess, the exception of if you're doing anything in pediatrics. If you're doing anything for kids, it's primarily private payer and Medicaid, or women's health is private payer and Medicaid. But outside of those really kind of those broad areas, it's typically the Medicare and private payers is where you're focused. I actually don't get a lot involved in out-of-pocket, simply because if you're going right to the consumer, or they're buying it directly from the hospital, so to speak, if I have my technology is being implanted in the hospital, you're not actually selling to the patient, you're selling to the hospital, who then the patient decides, I want to pay X amount of money to have this procedure done, and then they're paying the hospital. In my experience, again, for a lot of the technologies that I've worked on, that tends to be a very small minority. simply because of the dollars that get involved in terms of not only the technology they need to purchase, but also the procedure and the physician fees and all, anesthesiology, all of those sorts of things start to add up. And it quickly becomes thousands of dollars potentially. Most patients are like, yeah, that's why I have insurance, and I'd like for them to pay for this.
Yeah, really. I think that's definitely quite a different situation. So last time we talked, I enjoyed some of the rants you went on, and I thought it was really fun. And so I guess maybe we can open to the door for some of these. What are some big issues that you see going on, or things that people are messing up, or I don't know about frustrating, but things that people are doing maybe incorrectly, either be it on the company side or the insurance side?
Yeah, I won't get started on the insurance side because that's a whole different ball of wax. And quite frankly, I'm pretty biased, and I admit that freely. But I do think it's important to understand that insurance companies, they're doing what they need to do too. But at the end of the day, they're built to say no. So we need to take their perspective into account. Whether we agree or disagree is irrelevant. They're there, and quite frankly, I don't view them as the enemy, but they're in the way. So I need to get them out of the way as much as possible. And a couple of things that I did when I was inside companies and working for whatever, Medtronic or St. Jude Medical or whoever it was. And now that I tell companies as a consultant is, again, plan early and try to understand. Sometimes it may be enough to just say, I just got to get to market. One of the common misconceptions I hear that I think is a good luck moment is I'm going to go get 510K. I don't have to do clinical data. I'm going to collect all my data post-market. And then I'm going to give that data to the payers 5 years from now, and they're going to pay me. And that's where I go, good luck with that, because I haven't seen that strategy work very often. And just because you can get through regulatory quickly and easily, potentially through a 510K, especially without clinical data pathway, that may or may not be the best business strategy. And I would never tell anybody, hey, this is what you have to do. You have to do all this clinical data. But I guess from my perspective, you need to factor this in, and it might make the most business sense to try to get through the FDA as quickly as possible, but understand the pitfalls of doing that versus, hey, I can go 510K de novo, makes it a little bit harder for my competitors to follow. I know I'm going to need this data to convince somebody anyway. When I say anybody, private payers, or payers in order to actually pay for this. I think those are some of the things to think about for companies. I think companies are getting better at it. A decade ago, no one seemed to care. And particularly working with small companies or companies that are trying to get off the ground, what I'm hearing more and more is the first question out of investors' mouth isn't what's your FDA pathway? It's what's your reimbursement strategy? Because FDA is at least a somewhat known entity. And they're the last entity that will tell you as a company, if you do this study, if you do this work, we will get you to market. We will give you the clearance or the approval. Payers will never tell you that. I've never had a payer say that if you do this randomized controlled study, or if you do this post-market registry, I will pay for your device at the price you want it. That doesn't happen. So you're guessing a little bit based on publicly available information and experience and those sorts of things on what it may take for those private payers or Medicare to cover you. So thinking again about that how that impacts your business strategy so that you're making an informed decision is where we try to harp on the most, which is, again, just because the reimbursement guy says do this doesn't mean you should necessarily do it, but it should be factored into your decision, whether that's pricing, whether that's your clinical strategy, whether it's how do I get to market. I guess just to keep going on this a little bit later, like the three things as I work in and outside of companies. Marketing is, what do I want to say to the market? That's a really important thing. What do I want to be able to say about my product? Regulatory is, what can I say without going to jail? So that's really important. And then reimbursement is, who's going to pay for it? Those three things, in my opinion, should be dictating what your clinical strategy is. Not one, not two, but all three of those things. To be able to say, I want to be able to say what I want to, say it in a legal and compliant manner, and then have someone go, what you're saying makes sense, and I'm willing to pay X dollars for the procedure or the technology that you're providing. And so often have seen at least, I think companies are getting better at this, but I've seen it where we'll work backwards, where clinical is driving, here's the study we can do. Well, that's great that you can do it, but is that the study we need? And where's that? What's that delta, if any? Like sometimes they overlaps perfectly. Or, hey, FDA doesn't want me to do, I just need to do 50 patients and I'm good to go and I can get my clearance. Well, in my experience, and I'm not a clinical trial specialist, but in my experience, I can prove pretty much anything I want to with 50 patients. And just because the study shows what you want it to show doesn't mean you've convinced anybody of anything other than potentially the FDA. And with no offense to the FDA, but their bar is very different. They're safe and effective. Payers are medically reasonable and necessary. And if you could see me, the gap between my hands with safe and effective and medically reasonable and necessary is huge. And it continues to widen because, again, FDA writes no checks. They're not spending any money. Where Medicare and the payers of any kind, whether it be private payers or Medicaid or the VA, they are spending money. So they look at things differently. And so understanding what that can look like is a really big thing. And I think, again, what I'm seeing is more and more companies are figuring this out. And I think a lot of that has to do with their funding as well as exit strategy. Because one of the first questions I get when I'm doing diligence is, hey, Mark, we need to see what the reimbursement plan is. What's the reimbursement viability? We know we can work through the regulatory side, but we got to understand the black box that can be reimbursement as best we can, because that can make or break a technology. And so that's, I think to me at least, it's understanding and factoring in reimbursement as you make the big business decisions and develop the business strategy. I'm not saying it's the most important factor, but it's certainly as important as some of these other things, including the regulatory and the marketing messaging. It factors into pricing for sure. And those sorts of things, all as you look at all of the factors and go, okay, for our situation, maybe we need to hold off on reimbursement a little bit. That tends not to be my experience. We need to think about it sooner and earlier, but factoring in those things, there are instances where it makes sense to delay. Other times it makes sense to accelerate. And just understanding that makes, in my opinion at least, and I know I'm biased, but understanding the full business picture when reimbursement for most technologies that are truly regulated devices, even if they're FDA exempt, insurance is a really important, getting insurance coverage, getting the right coding, getting the payment that hopefully supports the average sales price we're looking for is critical. And so understanding what that looks like sooner rather than later is really important.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're making it sound like getting the FDA approval is the easy part. Like it's almost like graduating elementary school or something like this versus getting into Harvard or something like this would be more on the payer side. But yeah, I really like how you described it. Maybe FDA is like getting the hunting license and then getting reimbursement is almost like actually getting a boar or, deer or whatever you're hunting. I think that's really interesting.
I do think just real quick too with that, Leighton, just to pile on, just sorry to cut you off, but I think the other component of this is that your regulatory strategy can influence your reimbursement strategy and vice versa. So with the advent of breakthrough device designation and Medicare tying some things to that regulatory, to the FDA designation, your indication statement, that's the first thing payers look at. What are you indicated for? The broader your indication, general, I ablate soft tissue. Ablating soft tissue is a great regulatory claim in that you can do a lot of different things. But from a reimbursement perspective, if I'm a payer, I look at that very skeptically because I don't think you've studied as a company or as a therapy to ablate any soft tissue in the body, but you've got this broad general claim. And from a payer perspective, they're worried about overuse and abuse. And if you've got a very broad claim, that can work against you. And so figuring out how narrow or how wide can I be from a regulatory perspective and how that could impact my reimbursement strategy, and then layer breakthrough device on top of it and some other things, that's where you get the magic to happen, is when you're working consistently with, well, what market am I trying to target? How do I get there from an indication perspective? Can I make it broader? Can I make it narrower with what I'm going to study? Because ultimately it's how do I get there? And so factoring in those, that's where in a general sense, we talk about when you start thinking what your regulatory pathway might look like and what your indication statement might look like, and you're starting to think about what I may need to collect clinically just to meet the safe and effective threshold. Wow, I really want to overlay reimbursement on top of that because I might find, wow, the safe and effective bar isn't going to buy me anything. Yeah, it lets me go to market, but if I can't get anyone to pay for this, or I'm only limited to out of pocket for a $20,000 device, I'm going to sell, 3 of these a year versus I need to sell 3,000 a year to meet my revenue goals, those sorts of things. So that's where I think combining those two really at the front end is really important.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great way to look at it and save you time, which means money later on. So I guess you answered it a little bit, but what do you do? For example, if somebody comes to you like, I need help, what is your role, or what are you actually like, I don't know, engaging in when you talk to them? Are you just developing strategies and saying, okay, you guys need to do this in this kind of clinical trial? Are you helping run the clinical trial? Are you, I don't know, somehow, I saw a funny thing. This local business has jokes on the signs and everything like this. I go by every day, and it was funny. One day it said, a good lawyer knows the law, a great lawyer knows the judge. So are you somebody who knows the judge?
That's a great way to phrase that. In certain times, in certain instances, absolutely. And the general axiom of it's not what you know, it's who you know, absolutely plays into this. It depends, depending on what it is you need for your technology. And so what we do, and again, with other consultants, I think they do the same thing, or whether you've got internal people who are doing this, we really focus on where do you stand today from a reimbursement landscape? And again, all of these different components, coding, coverage, payment, they all work together, but they are independent things. So interdependent and independent, if that makes sense. So needing to understand, where do I have a coverage problem? Which, by the way, you'd mentioned earlier is the Holy Grail. It is the Holy Grail of the three components: coverage, coding, and payment. I got to have positive coverage, or I got nothing. I can have a code, I can have great payment, but if I don't have coverage, I got nothing. So of the three, I'd rather have coverage picked, but you need all three of them to work together, or to have them all in place to get quote unquote appropriate or adequate payment, or reimbursement. What we try to do is figure out, or what we do is figure out, well, where do you stand today? Are you described by existing codes? And if so, what does that payment associated with it look like? And what does the coverage environment look like for the patients we believe you're going to treat? Are they older patients, so it's Medicare? Are they disabled patients, which is also Medicare? I'm treating 45-year-olds. Well, that's probably commercial payers, the folks that get all of their insurance through their employer. I'm treating 45-year-olds. Well, I'm not as worried about Medicare patients then, because the 45-year-old is, I'm treating, 40 to 50-year-olds. That's not Medicare. And so where does the coverage look like? Do I fit into existing codes? If I do, can I live with the existing payment levels? If I don't fit into existing codes, what does that mean? What does that do for my time frame? What does that mean to engage other entities like Medicare, like professional physician societies, or the American Medical Association, because they're the ones that manage CPT coding? Do I need to get new coding in the hospital? And then ultimately, how does that tie into payment? Both for the physician, typically, who's going to implant or utilize my technology, as well as the facility, wherever that's done, whether it be in the physician's office, whether it be an ambulatory surgery center, or in the hospital. I want to make sure that both sides of that equation, the physician, who's more the labor of actually doing the procedure, and then the facility, wherever it's being performed, is the parts side of this, using an analogy of when you get your car fixed, you get a bill for parts and labor. It's the same thing with medical services. You get a bill for the labor, which is the physician. You get a bill for the parts, whatever entity you went to, a physician office or a hospital. You got to make sure both sides are paid for. As a device company, or a device company consultant, in my case, I have found that more often than not, the most important component from a payment perspective is really, while physician payment is absolutely important, and I need to understand how much physicians are going to get paid to do the procedures that involve my technology, I really need to make sure that whoever's buying my device, in most cases, it's the hospital or an ambulatory surgery center, they're getting paid. Because doctors prescribe or implant my technology, but again, depending on the technology, a lot of technologies aren't purchased by them. They decide if I'm going to use Medtronic or Boston Scientific or company X versus company Y, or this treatment makes sense where we are on the treatment pathway versus this other treatment. But most of the time, unless they're doing that procedure in their own clinic, they're taken to the hospital, they're taken to the ambulatory surgery center, have the procedure done. It's that entity that's buying your device that you're negotiating with. Are they buying it for $6,000? Are they buying it for $7,000? And so I need to make sure they get paid, because ultimately they're the ones writing the checks to me as a company for the products that I'm delivering. And so what we really try to do is figure out, where do you stand today? And then what are the options going forward? Trying to factor in as many external forces as possible. So we're always going to assume your clinical trial is going to work, and you're going to hit the milestones that you say are going to work, that you're targeting. And I think that's a key thing that we do too, is we try to work within your business parameters. So one of the first questions that we ask as we look at new technologies, there's a whole host of questions, but one of them is, what's your target ASP? What are you wanting to get for your price? We're not going to hold you to it. It doesn't commit you to anything, but are you wanting 500, 5,000, 10,000? $25,000 or more. And we'll try to do our best to get you there. But it's really trying to factor in, okay, so now that we know where things stand for you today and what you're trying to accomplish based on your indication statement, FDA pathway, your timing, what your clinical publication plan looks like, how much clinical data you'll have to support yourself at launch in the first 3 years after. Here's what we would recommend from a reimbursement perspective. What are we going to do with payers on coverage? What do we need to do on coding? And what do we need to do on payment? Because each of those have different timeframes and different requirements. So again, trying to lay those things out early in the process so you can plan accordingly. And I think just as important as well as plan is with your board of directors, with your investors, with your CEO, with the street, just so you make sure that you're not saying, oh yeah, we'll get a new CPT, we'll get FDA approval, we're getting a new CPT code next month. Probably not. And nothing worse than having to go back and say, I was wrong. It's actually 3 years away, not next month. So really trying to work with companies to figure out where do we stand today? What's that plan look like based on your business assumptions? And what does it look like for the next 3 years or whatever time frame that for some of those major key milestones? And then, last comment here, really trying to make it a plan that is adaptable, because any plan is as good as the point in time information you have. So if a major assumption changes, so our clinical trial enrollment typically lags. Enrollment usually takes longer than expected for a variety of reasons. If it pushes back a year, this is how the plan moves with that. Or sometimes it happens where things get accelerated for whatever reason. Hey, we got enrolled very quickly. We're 6 months faster. Okay, then the plan can move with that. So it's not just, hey, we did this plan and dates are set in stone. It's, basically from a starting point of here's FDA approval, and then here's here's what you need to do and what time frame before FDA approval. Here's what you need to do after FDA approval, and those sorts of time frames. And that's what we try to do with our clients as we lay out what the strategy and tactics need to look like to launch a product.
Yeah, very cool. So what are maybe some big successes or failures that you've seen companies go through, and maybe one of each?
Oh boy, big failures is easy. I think and there's various examples of this. I think you be careful what you ask for, because unless you're ready to know, unless you know the answer, you don't ask the question. So for example, and this is dating myself a little bit, but common misconception in my opinion is people say, if I don't have a positive coverage policy, I don't have coverage. And I would disagree with that completely. And the reason I would say that is, just because you've done a 100-patient study and you've got 6-month endpoints, that doesn't mean you convinced anybody of anything. And so trying to stay under the radar screen might be your best plan, so that you do collect some post-market data. You get longer-term follow-up, because I guarantee you, if payers don't like to see anything less, in my experience, anything less than a year data. So that you accomplish something in 30, on most technologies, particularly I think for, pain control or something that should have a durable benefit. And so it's not an acute endpoint, but for long-term benefit, they're looking for at least 12-month outcomes. Well, you give them 12, they really want 24. You give them 24, they really want 36 or 5-year data. So asking for coverage prior to when you're ready, it can be again, be careful what you ask for. You start pushing saying, I need a coverage policy, you might get one. It may not say what you want it to say. And now you've been cut out of that market. And we've seen that happen with a variety of technologies, both on the commercial side and Medicare. So understand the audience you're asking and what evidence you think you're going to need, because invariably you need more than you think. On success stories, I think there's a variety of them as well. And again, what I have seen, whether it's companies I've worked with or not, is they've done that adequate planning. And again, it depends a little bit on the situation. If you're a fast follower or a Me Too product versus if you're paving the way. I think there's certainly some technologies that have done a really nice TAVR, the transcatheter aortic valve replacement. I think has done a nice job with the reimbursement that's there. And it took some effort to get there. And that may not be the best example in the world, because that's with Edwards and Medtronic, so two of the big guys in the medical technology space. But we've also seen some very successful small companies that navigate these processes very well. Shockwave Medical comes to mind. SI Bone, I think, has done a nice job. So there's a variety of companies that can do this as well. And again, I think what a lot of common traits with companies like this is they think about these things early and making sure that they're tailoring their strategy to match what they're trying to accomplish in the market, as well as what their products need. Is it more coverage? Is it more coding? Is it more payment? Is it all three? And really figuring it out from there and asking and figuring out, where do I need to push and pull? Is it engaged with Medicare? Is it engaged with the trade associations? Is it engaged with the AMA, or physician societies? Is it engaged with my competitors? Or are my competitors trying to work against me? And there still are competitors. There can be some tactics and things you want to think about from a reimbursement perspective to try to exclude them from what you're doing, sometimes include them, because again, reimbursement can float all boats. I don't know if that's too general, but there's a variety of success stories that come to mind. It just depends on the technology and what needed to be accomplished. I've got examples certainly where we didn't think coverage was an issue, so we focused more on coding and payment, got that in place even before FDA approval occurred. There have been other instances where we had coding and payment, but it was all about coverage. And then how do we manage that appropriately, both with Medicare and or the private payers? Because again, those tend to be the two big groups that are going to be predominant for most devices in getting coverage. It can be done either way. Ideally, you're thinking about it early so that you minimize the time from FDA clearance or approval to when appropriate reimbursement is in place, so that it takes that off the table as you're negotiating with and discussing the technology with your physician customers, with your hospital customers, or wherever the technology has been utilized, that really it's not so much about the finances and it's more about the clinical benefits that your technology brings.
Okay. Yeah, that's very promising. Shows that there's a big delta, big difference between a good and bad. I guess we didn't talk about this. How did you get into this field, and what's been your career path getting into this?
Yeah, I will say it's a great question. I fell into this. This was not an active career choice of wanting to be a reimbursement person. I think that's more common than not in terms of this isn't some people like to be regulatory or quality or marketing or sales. I would argue, at least in my experience and the folks I know, that reimbursement is more you fall into it. I came out of my undergraduate degree many moons ago and joined up with a consulting practice in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That the work I did specifically was Medicare hospital cost reports. Back when hospitals used to get paid, at least in portion, on cost, like a tax return. They got settled up and they get paid too much, or did they get money back every year? And with a bunch of different variations and steps along the way, that really facilitated in 2003 when I interviewed at Medtronic. And they were like, yeah, you've got consulting background. Yeah, you've got an MBA. Yeah, you've got all this stuff. They went back to my undergraduate degree where they said, talk to me about that experience with your accounting background and what did you do when you talk about Medicare reimbursement? I talked about hospital cost reports, and that led me to basically what I'm doing today, which is they said, great, as long as you understand what a DRG is and what CPT means and APC and all these other acronyms that you can help us navigate, that's exactly what we need. And I took off from there. So it was not a conscious career decision. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoy the work in terms of figuring out with companies, the policy side, some engagement with Medicare, physician societies. It combines a lot of different skills into one role, and I love the variety. So it's worked out really well for me, but it's by no means something that I went, oh yeah, I should go be a reimbursement guy or reimbursement gal for a reimbursement person for medical technologies. It's much more niche-y than that, at least in my experience. It's becoming more prominent, obviously, as for a long time, it was a thing about regulatory. Just 10, 15 years ago was primarily just get through regulatory and we'll be in good shape. Now it's, well, yeah, we got to get through regulatory and the FDA, but it's really about how do we get paid. I think this field is expanding and growing, which is great, but certainly a convoluted path on how I got here.
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's just so unknown, I guess, that you couldn't have planned it or something like this. Mark, this has been a pleasure. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
I could go on for hours and that would bore everybody to death. So I won't do that. But so I don't know that I have anything other than more specific, unless you haven't heard me quite say it yet. It's just plan early and factor in reimbursement early into your planning processes. And you'll be in good a shape as you can possibly once you get to market launch. I really appreciate the opportunity here, Layden, and happy to answer any questions that your listeners may have at some point as they take a listen to this podcast. But I very much appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And I can include contact info in the show notes as well. So if people want to reach out, they can do that. So thank you, Mark.
Absolutely. Happy to answer any questions that I can.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thanks, Layden.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.